A warm welcome to everyone who's joining us. Good to have you with us, and a particular warm welcome to Stephen, who's got firm credentials in the north of England himself, but even though he's lived elsewhere for a long time, like me. And he's going to talk to us today about the Lancashire Gentry in the 16th and 17th centuries, and bring in some references, at least, to his own family. So over to you, Stephen.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. I guess the first thing to say for those of you who are here is that at least on my Zoom things, it's got the names of people in the bottom left-hand corner. And I assure you, I am called Stephen, not Julie. My wife tends to use Zoom more than I do, and the computer obviously thought I am Julie. Next slide, please. You'll see from the slide about to appear the coverage of the presentation. Broadly, I'm going to start with the general and move to the particular. Next slide, please. First then, who were the gentry? The 16th century saw a huge change in social relationships. It led to Tudor society becoming much more divided than previously. Feudal society had recognised three divinely ordained estates: king and nobility, clergy, and peasantry, the rest. Tudor contemporaries recognised four: the nobility and gentlemen, citizens and burgesses, yeomen, and the rest. And the rest included, for example, merchants as well as anybody else. These groupings, of course, were radically different from what had gone before, but contemporaries actually disagreed about what was it that divided you into what they called the four sorts of society. It was a period of considerable upward mobility. There were lots of opportunities for people to increase their wealth, particularly as the country's economy grew. Every county was different in that respect. Indeed, at this time, England has been described as a confederation of county communities. Though I don't think you should exaggerate that too much. But despite the variations across the country, the social elite who comprised the landed class of nobility and gentlemen prospered greatly after 1540, and this upward rise, this growing prosperity has been termed the rise of the gentry, and I'll come on to that shortly. Next slide, please. There's been a huge debate among historians about what defined the gentry. And as you'll see from the slide, there are several things there that suggest it's not simple. I mean, in terms of the first bullet of not defined by formal heraldic recognition, a list of Lancashire's freeholders at about 1600 was compiled and listed 770, but only about 8 of them had been acknowledged as entitled to bear a coat of arms by the heraldic visitations of the time. So clearly contemporaries thought of a much wider range of people as being gentlemen than did if you like, the formal systems of the country. And a key point here is that gentility was self-identified. One of the key things about it is that local recognition, in other words, that contemporaries distinguished the gentry as being the chief inhabitants of their parish. the better sort and the ones who were of greater sufficiency or estate. And they were also the ancientest families in their locality. In this context, there are quite a lot of divisions between the gentry. The county gentry, the magnates as they're sometimes called, were firmly distinguished from the lesser gentry. The magnates had estates and social relationships across a large part of the county. The latter influence only in the locality, the parish or nearby parishes where they lived. Next slide, please. At the heart of their status and their prosperity was land ownership. Land ownership, of course, provided wealth, but importantly, it provided income from both direct farming and rentals. As landed wealth and income grew, so did status, because so did prosperity. Of course, if income fell, then potentially the gentry were put into the difficult situation that they needed to fund a lifestyle, one based on leisure, from a declining income, and that could lead to a vicious downward spiral for some. In the early Tudor period, landowners sought to consolidate their estates, and they were actually unwilling to dispose of them. They regarded them as family land. And it therefore became difficult for younger sons and daughters to maintain their social status except through the mechanism of good marriages. But from the 1560s, the diversification of trade and industry began to make a commercial background more socially acceptable for the gentry's younger sons. And by the early 17th century, this was certainly the case. It's been stated for many years that this change was much slower in Lancashire compared to other counties. But I've been doing some research and I'm preparing a paper which I hope shortly to submit to Bertie Dockrell that challenges this quite long-standing view. Next slide, please. The Stuart period saw major economic expansion. London, particularly, grew rapidly. One result was that the southern counties, the richer part of the country, actually grew even richer, whilst the poorer north and other poor parts of the country pretty much stood still. Another result was the major economic and social change, which led to greater stratification in society. As I indicated previously, the borderline between gentlemen and non-gentlemen was probably the most important social distinction of the period. And after the Restoration, these distinctions grew wider. Pressure to demonstrate wealth and status grew, and the end result was that there were many more means of acquiring wealth, but there were at the same time many opportunities for debt. And the end result of debt could be social oblivion if the debts were called in. So social mobility, upward and downward, was a key feature and was increasingly varied by the later 17th century. Next slide, please. The term the rise and fall of the gentry was first coined by the famous historian R.H. Tawney in 1941. He argued that the phenomenon resulted from the development of capitalist agriculture, and the causes have been much debated ever since, fiercely debated, in fact. Several points are now clear. First, the gentry did not arise out of nothing. There was a sort of proto-gentry as early as the 13th century. And in Lancashire, these were the ones who started to expand what was a frontier economy by expanding onto the wastelands, the moorlands, and gradually trying to assert ownership over it and rights to use it. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't. Importantly, it's recognised that Tawney's thesis, insofar as it was true, was much more applicable to the South and the Midlands than it was to the North. And more generally, the rise of the gentry is now seen as simply being a part of, indeed, a consequence of much wider economic changes in society nationally. Indeed, the rise of capitalist agriculture, which was the driver as far as Tawney was concerned, is now seen as an effect rather than a cause. There's also been a lot of controversy about the impact, the economic impact of the land sales that resulted from the dissolution of the monasteries. It's now thought that there was actually a lot of continuity of occupation, and this simply consolidated and reinforced landholding patterns. The reason for that is that because the initial purchases were made by the established county landowners in many places, and they then sold on the land that they acquired, often to the existing occupiers, who were, of course, originally were tenants. Whalley Abbey provides a very good example of this. The Abbey lands were sold by the Crown to two local bigwigs, Richard Ashton and John Bradle, and they eventually carved up the ownership between them, kept some of it for themselves and sold on the rest. And that process involves selling the messuage now called Asterley to George Shuttleworth and his son and heir Gilbert, and they were pre-existing tenants of Whalley Abbey. Next slide, please. The Lancashire Gentry in many ways reflected the broader national characteristics that I referred to, but there were some really important differences. I've set them out there. The health warning is that the research that underpins that is quite dated. The classic studies were in the 1970s by Blackwood and Haig. But as I indicated earlier, my own researches are beginning to challenge some of those conclusions, at least in relation to trade and maybe education. But I've got a lot more work to do on the education side of things. Next slide, please. So that sets out the wider background of the gentry. What I want to do now is turn to one family and try and illustrate some of those points in a Lancashire context. Now, of course, this isn't intended to be a talk about my family history, so I'm not going to get into too much detail on that. I'm going to try and draw out wider points. But just bear with me for a bit, because you do perhaps need to understand the context. So to start, they owned a property called Asterley. It's just to the west of Whalley. As I've said earlier, the family was on record as tenants as early as 1537. They bought it from the Ashton and Bradle in 1553. And were there for the best part then of a century, longer, before debts forced them to sell up. They built up a much wider estate over time, which I'll show a map of. And after they sold Asterley itself, they retained some of that wider estate until finally debt forced them to sell the last of the 17th century. The photograph shows Asterley in the 1950s. It was then called Easterley Farm. It was a substantial Tudor house built in the 1590s, just after they, built in the late 1590s as they expanded. It was extended in the 1650s, 60s. It was demolished in the 1960s, but in its heyday, it was one of the largest houses in Whalley Township. Next slide, please. This slide summarises the generations I'm talking about. In fact, there were 6 generations, but Gilbert predeceased his father, and so in terms of inheritance, the land went from George to William, then to his son George, to his son William, to his son William. So we're effectively in land ownership terms talking about 5 generations. In terms of tracing their fortunes through the rest of this talk, there's lots of information and surviving records, particularly property transactions, involvement in legal cases, lots of local administrative proceedings, wills, probate records, all the usual stuff. A lot, of course, is in Lancashire archives, but Chetham's Library, Manchester Library, the Borthwick Institute and the National Archives had a lot of stuff too. And I also found useful material in the National Archives of Sweden and in Stockholm City Archives. I should also take the opportunity, I think, to acknowledge with thanks the help I got from Professor Henry French and Chris Spencer in relation to their land holdings in the Sladeburn area, which was extremely helpful at a point when I was struggling. Next slide, please. As I've said earlier, George and Father William were co-tenants in 1537. Father died. George and his son and then Gilbert bought it, and they rapidly extended the estate from the 29 to 60 acres, and that property, Asterley, was the core of their eventual estate and the family seat. But what's really interesting about this slide is that they were actually renting land in Bowland and buying land in Bowland before they managed to acquire their core estate at Asterley. And the other thing that's interesting is how quickly after buying Asterley, George was recognised locally, acknowledged as a gentleman. He was named in the 1558 list of gentlemen of the best calling as one of the leading 25 gentlemen in Whalley parish. He wasn't wealthy, but he had a good social standing. He married his heir William to Alice Noel of Reed. The Noels of Reed, of course, were a very high status family. And in fact, at the point of their marriage, or shortly after, Noel was listed as 5th wealthiest of the gentlemen of the best calling in Blackburn 100, and he was thus much wealthier than the famous Shuttleworths of Gawthorpe, who at that point were only 32nd in the list. So for George and William, this sounds like quite a coup in terms of marrying well. Next slide, please. The map shows the Shuttleworths estates. Now, if you look in the middle of the map, hopefully you can see Whalley in capitals and marked by a diamond, and Asterley is just to the, I suppose it's at about 20 past in relation to Whalley. Their land ownership, the core was round Asterley, but I've marked with little squares the properties they owned, and you can see they stretch from Colne in the west to Goosenar in the east, down to Wrightington, and a lot up into the Forest of Bowland, which of course then was in Yorkshire. So that's an astonishing growth of properties over a period of a century. By the 1660s, that was the extent of their land. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, what I'm trying to do in this slide is show over time the extension of their land ownership, what their income was, and what the split was between the income from farming, in other words, their direct farming profits, and their rental income. And I've split with colour coding between those different things. So you can see that between 1537 and 1665, the estates had expanded from 29 to 1,300 acres. That the balance of farmed directly versus rented out changed dramatically. They started with just a small amount that they owned directly. They rapidly started getting land to rent out. But by 1665, the rental property was much, much larger in area than the land they farmed directly. And you can also see that the income that came from those two sources changed. And finally, their estimate of income, and I got this by using a whole, all the documentation about how much estates they had, inferring from the documentation and a number of other things how they were farming the land, and then secondary literature about the income that one could draw from different types of activity. But by 1665, the slides disappeared, please, Fiona. But by 1665, they were earning about £350 a year in income, which puts them well up in the list of the list of, if you like, the prosperous middling gentry. Next slide, please. So as their income increased, of course, their family social status increased. And you can see how, in terms of the divisions between parish gentry, middling gentry, and so on, it changed over time. And William, born in 1620, who died in 1665, was actually pretty high status at the time of his death. He was amongst the most prosperous, as I said. He displayed a whole range of the middling gentry's financial and social characteristics. For example, he had obviously large land holdings spread across the county. That included a manor lordship, which was always a good status symbol. Socially well connected, long-standing gentry marriage and kinship relationships across that whole area. He'd got formal acknowledgement from the heralds of his gentlemanly status and his right to bear arms. He'd extended his house. He had office in county government, rather as well as that is the mark of making it. He was, in the time of the Commonwealth, a county clerk of the peace, and after the Restoration, he was appointed as a duchy commissioner, elected as a constable, and of course, he was a parish churchwarden. And the family was prosperous. The income was probably about 350, as I said, but the value of the estates, in other words, the wealth, was probably in the range 1,600 to £2,000. And I got that from an analysis of William's will. Next slide, please. So, how did the Shuttleworths manage to generate this success? Well, there were 5 key factors, as I've set out there. I think the important point about the first, the land acquisition, is that it was patient, it was intergenerational, and it was founded on profits from good estate and financial management. But almost has a suspicion that they were a bit tight-fisted, to be honest, although I've no documentary evidence for that. In terms of managing their estates, it's actually quite important that the first three heirs inherited as adults. That enabled them, of course, to learn on the job from their fathers before taking on full responsibility for managing Asterley and its estates themselves. Thirdly, they were prudent, thrifty, and they managed to sustain that over 4 generations. They avoided litigation, and this is an interesting point because over 2 centuries, the family was involved only once in potentially financially ruinous litigation that directly affected their property. They were involved in litigation which didn't directly affect them, as, for example, witnesses or whatever. And that claim was withdrawn or settled out of court. And this contrasts with many other gentry, local gentry. If you look through the records of the Duchy Court, there are many, many cases of gentry families. Some of them seem to be almost continuously engaged in litigation of one sort or another. In terms of religious reformation and then the later political divisions, they clearly managed to straddle the fences. The religious affiliations are unknown, but there are various strands that suggest some commitment to the Reformed Church after the break with Rome, and later quite definite indications that they inclined towards Puritanism. The family's allegiance in the Civil War is also unknown, unlike their relatives, the Shuttleworths of Gorthorpe, who were very firmly on the Parliament side. But the signs are that they, at least outwardly, must have supported the Parliament. Otherwise, how would he have been appointed Clerk of the Peace during the Commonwealth? But having said that, he didn't align himself with the Commonwealth so closely that he was penalised after the Restoration. In fact, he did very well after the Restoration because he was appointed as a Duchy Commissioner. And finally, the last bullet is actually very important when you're considering anything about families at this time, what's been termed by Henry French as demographic good fortune, that families' heirs survived into adulthood. And this was the case with the Shuttleworths until the last one in the 6th generation of this story, William, who was 8 when his father died in 1665. Next slide, please. So that leads me on to the sad story of William, born in 1557, clearly underage. In fact, his father, he put the children's care into the hands of his wife, specifying that William, born 1557, would only inherit the estates when he was 21. So he didn't succeed to the estates and become William Shuttleworth of Asterley until 1679. Picking up my comment on the previous slide, obviously, therefore, he didn't have the training in estate management that benefited his forebears. But actually, he seems to have been a spendthrift. I mean, within a year of succeeding to the estate, he'd started taking out large mortgages. And he was able to do so, I think, because his uncle, who'd been a merchant in Stockholm, died in 1673, and I guess he was using that, and he was the sole heir of that estate, and I guess he was able to use that to negotiate various mortgages. But the inheritance never materialised because Uncle George's estate in Sweden was caught up in a whole series of legal disputes relating to trade, conflicts with other merchants and landowners who all descended at a time when Swedish foreign policy was very anti foreign traders settled in Sweden. And there's a whole set of things that come together, which I won't go into the detail of, which meant that actually the whole estate was used up in Stockholm, either paying off debts or was confiscated, because the Swedes started acting on a law which said any foreign trader who lived in Stockholm or in Sweden who died, a large proportion of that estate, 1/3 I think, was confiscated. It was forfeit to the crown. So the end result was that William never got the estate that he was, the fortune he was expecting to get. He sold Asterley in 1682. In a disastrous marriage settlement, he'd actually married Sarah Holt before the marriage settlement was concluded, and he incurred the enmity of his father-in-law, who actually took the opportunity to protect his daughter's interests, but otherwise really have a go at William. I mean, you read between the lines and it just seems like Alexander Holt, the father-in-law, really took a dislike to William Shuttleworth. And by 1694, he was in dire straits. He finally sold off his lands in 1696. And he stopped being called a gentleman very early on. He lived for a while off his reputation, but the end result was he sank into social oblivion. So, next slide, Fiona. So some concluding thoughts. This family, I think, provides a good example of the rise and fall of a gentry family. For us in the society, I suppose it provides a particularly good example because in some ways it illustrates not just national trends, but some aspects of why Lancashire gentry were a bit different to those of other parts of the country. What it really illustrates is the way that the gentry were involved in what I've called the financial and social snakes and ladders. It's at the heart of the phenomenon known as the rise and fall of the gentry. Their story illustrates the validity of many characteristics of Lancashire parish and middling gentry that were first identified 50 years ago. And it gives additional insights into the strategies they used to alluded to that. But it also challenges two previous assumptions about the Lancashire gentry, about which more research is needed. And as I've indicated, I'm working on, and I hope to provide a paper to Bertie Dockrell this side of Christmas.